Picture yourself stepping outside on a December morning in 1981. The cold hits you like a physical blow, so sharp it makes your lungs burn. Your breath doesn't just fog, it crystallizes instantly in the air. The ground beneath your feet cracks with each step, frozen solid as concrete. This wasn't just winter. This was the beginning of something Britain had never experienced before. The coldest winter in recorded history was about to grip the nation by the throat and refuse to let go for 3 brutal months. If you lived through the winter of 1981 to 1982, you know this wasn't just bad weather. This was survival. This was a test of everything Britain thought it knew about endurance, community, and what happens when nature decides to remind you who's really in charge. The temperatures would plummet to levels that broke every record in the book. The snow would fall for days without stopping. And for the first time in living memory, the entire country would grind to a complete halt. The signs started appearing in late November 1981. Weather forecasters noticed something unusual happening in the atmosphere above the Atlantic. High-pressure systems were behaving strangely, parking themselves in positions that should have been impossible. Arctic air was being dragged down from the polar regions like never before. But even the experts didn't realize what was coming. They couldn't have predicted that Britain was about to experience temperatures colder than Antarctica. December arrived with a vengeance that caught everyone off guard. The first week felt normal enough, typical British winter weather that people grumbled about but managed just fine. Then December 5th hit and suddenly the temperature plummeted like a stone dropped down a well. Overnight, the entire character of the winter changed. What had been manageable cold became something else entirely. Something that made your skin sting the moment you stepped outside. By the second week of December, Britain was in the grip of something unprecedented. The cold wasn't just severe, it was relentless. Day after day, the mercury refused to climb above freezing. Night after night, temperatures dropped to levels that made headlines across Europe. Weather stations recorded readings that operators checked and double-checked, convinced their instruments were malfunctioning. They weren't. The countryside transformed into an alien landscape. Rivers that had flowed freely for centuries froze solid from bank to bank. Harbours along the south coast, areas that had never seen ice, became skating rinks. Even parts of the sea began to freeze, something that hadn't happened in living memory. The cold was so intense it defied everything people thought they knew about British weather. December 13th became a date etched into the memory of everyone who experienced it. In Shawbury, Shropshire, the temperature dropped to minus 25.2 degrees Celsius. It was the coldest December temperature ever recorded in England, a record that stands to this day. But Shawbury wasn't alone. Across the country, weather stations registered readings that would have been remarkable in the Scottish Highlands, but were appearing in places that had never seen such extremes. The human cost was immediate and devastating. People woke up to find their pipes had burst overnight, flooding homes with water that turned to ice before it could be mopped up. Central heating systems failed as boilers couldn't cope with the unprecedented demand. Families huddled around single rooms, burning whatever they could find to stay warm. The elderly and vulnerable found themselves in genuine danger, trapped in homes that had become iceboxes. Transport networks began failing within days. Roads became death traps as gritting lorries couldn't keep pace with the freezing conditions. Train tracks cracked under the stress of metal contracting in temperatures no engineer had planned for. Airports closed as fuel lines froze and aircraft couldn't function in conditions that exceeded their operational limits. For the first time since the war, Britain's infrastructure was being systematically defeated by the weather. But December was just the beginning. As the month wore on, it became clear that this wasn't a temporary cold snap that would pass with the new year. The high-pressure system responsible for dragging Arctic air down to Britain showed no signs of moving. Weather maps looked like something from a different planet, with isobars arranged in patterns meteorologists had never seen before. The cold was here to stay, and it was getting worse. Villages across the countryside found themselves cut off as snow began falling on top of the already frozen ground. What started as a dusting became inches, then feet. Roads that were passable in the morning became impassable by afternoon. Emergency services struggled to reach people who needed help. Farmers watched helplessly as livestock succumbed to conditions that no amount of preparation could have prevented. The psychological impact was as brutal as the physical reality. People who had lived in Britain their entire lives suddenly felt like strangers in their own country. The familiar landscape had been replaced by something hostile and unforgiving. Simple tasks like walking to the shops became expeditions that required planning and courage. Children couldn't play outside for more than minutes at a time before the cold became dangerous. Man and Christmas. 1981 passed in a haze of unprecedented cold and growing fear. Families gathered not just for celebration but for warmth, cramming into single rooms to share body heat. Traditional Christmas activities became impossible as the cold made even short journeys treacherous. The festive season that should have brought joy became a test of endurance that pushed communities to their limits. As December ended and January 1982 began, Britain braced itself for what was coming next. The weather forecasts painted a picture that seemed impossible to believe. The cold was about to get worse, much worse, and Mother Nature was preparing to unleash a blizzard that would make everything that had come before seem like a gentle rehearsal for the main event. January 8th, 1982 started like any other freezing morning in what had already become Britain's winter, from hell. People woke up in bedrooms so cold they could see their breath indoors, wrapped in every blanket they owned, dreading the moment they'd have to leave the warmth of their beds. But by evening, January 8th would be remembered as the day Britain disappeared under a blanket of snow so thick, so relentless, that entire towns vanished from existence. The blizzard began quietly, almost politely. A few flakes drifting down around tea time, nothing that seemed particularly threatening after weeks of brutal cold. But within hours, those gentle flakes had become a wall of white that swallowed everything in its path. The wind picked up, howling like something alive and angry, driving the snow horizontally across the landscape. This wasn't just snowfall, this was nature declaring war. By midnight, the snow was falling so heavily that streetlights became useless, their beams swallowed by the white curtain that had descended over Britain. The wind, gusting at gale force, picked up the fresh powder and hurled it into drifts that grew taller by the hour. What had been roads in the morning became invisible valleys carved between towering walls of snow. Cars disappeared completely, buried so deep that their owners wouldn't find them for days. The combination was deadly perfect. Temperatures hovering between -2 and -4 degrees Celsius meant the snow stayed powder dry, light as feathers but accumulating with frightening speed. The easterly gale force winds grabbed this powder and sculpted it into drifts that defied belief. In exposed areas across Wales and southern England, snow piled up 6 metres high, creating white mountains where none had existed before. Emergency services found themselves fighting a battle they couldn't win. Police stations received hundreds of calls from people trapped in their homes, their cars, their workplaces, but response vehicles couldn't move through snow that reached their roofs. Fire engines became stuck attempting rescues, adding to the crisis rather than solving it. Ambulances sat useless in station yards, their crews watching helplessly as the blizzard made roads impassable. The M4 motorway, Britain's main arterial road linking London to Wales, became a frozen graveyard of abandoned vehicles. Hundreds of drivers found themselves trapped as snowdrifts swept across the carriageway, burying cars up to their windows. Some sat in their vehicles for hours, engines running until fuel ran out, heaters fighting a losing battle against cold that seeped through every seal and gap. Others abandoned their cars and tried to walk, trudging through snow that reached their chests, following the barely visible line of motorway barriers. Train services collapsed within hours of the blizzard's arrival. Signals froze, points became immovable under tons of drifted snow, and locomotives couldn't generate enough power to push through drifts that towered above their cabs. Passengers on the few services still running found themselves stranded in carriages that became temporary shelters, sharing body heat and whatever food they had while waiting for rescue that might not come for days. Cardiff, Wales Airport became a symbol of the chaos engulfing the country. A Met Office observer found himself trapped at the facility for an entire week, watching through windows as the world outside disappeared under an ever-growing blanket of white. When he finally escaped, he discovered roads that had been carved down to single tracks, narrow channels cut through snowbanks that rose higher than double-decker buses on either side. The landscape looked like something from an Arctic expedition, not the familiar streets of Wales. Villages across South Wales found themselves completely cut off from the outside world. Entire communities disappeared from contact as telephone lines snapped under the weight of ice and snow. In some areas, drifts blocked roads so completely that even military vehicles couldn't break through. Residents rationed whatever food they had, melting snow for water when pipes froze solid, burning furniture to keep warm when coal supplies ran out. The human stories from those 36 hours of continuous snowfall became the stuff of legend. Farmers walked miles through waist-deep snow to check on livestock, only to find barns collapsed under the weight and animals that had survived the record cold finally succumbing to the blizzard. Shopkeepers opened their doors to find their businesses completely buried, accessible only through windows on upper floors that had become ground-level entrances. Children who had been thrilled by the novelty of snow days found themselves prisoners in their own homes, watching through frost-covered windows as the familiar world outside transformed into an alien landscape. Parents struggled to keep families warm and fed as power lines snapped under the combined assault of wind and ice, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness that would last for days. Medical emergencies became life or death races against impossible conditions. Pregnant women went into labor in homes that couldn't be reached by ambulances. Heart attack victims waited for help that couldn't arrive. Elderly residents in isolated cottages faced the brutal choice between burning their furniture or freezing to death, with no guarantee that anyone would be able to check on them until the storm passed. The blizzard raged for 36 relentless hours, but its effects would last for weeks. When the snow finally stopped falling on January 9th, Britain woke up to find itself transformed beyond recognition. What had been a functioning modern nation had become an Arctic wasteland where survival depended on community cooperation and individual resourcefulness that hadn't been tested since wartime. The winter of 1981 to 1982 was Britain's coldest on record, but it was so much more than just numbers on a thermometer. It was the winter that showed what happens when nature strips away all the comforts of modern life and reduces existence to its most basic elements: warmth, shelter, community. For 3 months, millions of people discovered what their grandparents had known during wartime, that survival isn't guaranteed and neighbours become lifelines. Those who lived through it carry the memories like scars: the sound of pipes bursting in the night, the sight of their breath indoors, the terror of being trapped in a car as snow buried the world around them. But they also remember something else: the way strangers helped strangers, the way communities pulled together when everything else fell apart, the way Britain proved it could endure anything nature threw at it. The records from that winter still stand today: minus 27.2 degrees at Braemar. 6-metre snow drifts across Wales, 36 hours of continuous blizzard that buried an entire nation. But the real legacy isn't in the record books. It's in the knowledge that when everything goes wrong, when the power fails and the roads close and the world becomes unrecognisable, people find a way to survive. If you remember that winter, if you lived through it, share your story in the comments below. If your parents told you about it or you heard about it in the news, share that too. These memories matter. They remind us what we're capable of enduring and what we're capable of overcoming when we face it together.